This video is going to cover sample types and biases from Unit 3. So a reminder, when we talk about the population, we're talking about everyone, and when we talk about a sample, we're talking just about a part of a whole. When we're talking about parameter values, those go with the population. P's go together, parameters go with population. And when we're talking about statistics, they have to do with a sample. S's go together, sample statistics. As far as types of sampling go, the most common and most important is a simple random sample. This is when we insist that every possible sample has an equal chance of being selected. It's the same as when we put all the people's names in a hat and we draw out names randomly. Not only does any person have an equal chance of being selected, but any group of people also has an equal chance of being selected. Any differences that we see from sample to sample are called sampling variability or natural sampling variation. Next up is stratified sampling, and this has a lot of similarities with the next type, which is cluster sampling. Stratified sampling is used when we have groups we expect will differ on whatever issue it is that we're polling. One of the benefits of using stratified sampling is that it's going to reduce the variability in our results. So say, for example, we think males and females are going to have different results. If we stratify, we can say we want to make sure we get 50% males, 50% females, instead of mistakenly ending up with something like 80% males, 20% females. Statistics are going to vary less from one sample to another when we use stratified sampling. It's also going to let us notice those differences in between the groups. So if males are different than females, we'll see those in our results. When we use cluster sampling, that also involves us splitting our population into groups. But unlike stratified sampling, the reason we use cluster sampling is because we think that our groups are essentially the same. In the last example, we were talking about how men and women were different with respect to what we were sampling. With cluster sampling, it would be something like grades 10, 11, and 12 all feel the same about some issue, so we don't have to sample all of them. We can just pick one. So in cluster sampling, we split our population into clusters. We're going to select one or more of those clusters and perform a census on those groups. We talk to everybody and sample everybody in the groups. Cluster and stratified sampling are not the same. We stratify to ensure that different groups are represented in the sample in the correct proportions. Clusters are already largely the same, so selecting just one or a few would be representative of the whole population. In systematic samples, we're selecting individuals systematically, which means we're selecting, say, every 10th or every 13th person. We always want to include some type of randomization to make the sample valid, so we're going to start our systematic selection on a randomly selected individual. Every valid method of sampling must have some form of randomization. Now on to sample biases. The most common bias is the voluntary response bias, and this is when respondents choose to be included in a survey. These are almost always biased. We don't want to draw conclusions based on a voluntary response sample for the reason that people with strong opinions are more likely to respond. They're strongly motivated to actually go through the trouble of answering the questions in this survey. Convenience sampling is when we sample individuals who are easy to obtain responses from. And a note, voluntary response and convenience are both biases and types of sampling. A few other types of bias, first one being non-response bias. This is when we've incorporated randomization, but there's a certain subsection of our population that when we go to talk to them, we don't get responses for them for whatever reason. Maybe they don't answer the phone, maybe they don't want to answer the questions. So the key thing about non-response bias is that the people who aren't responding differ in some way from the people that are responding. Response bias, on the other hand, is anything in the survey that influences the responses. Maybe I'm asking you questions about the class, and since I'm the teacher, you're answering in a way that would be different than if one of your peers asked you. Bad sampling frame is when we sample individuals who are not part of the population of interest. This comes up a lot in politics for polling presidential elections, for example. There's a difference in sampling all adults versus registered voters versus likely voters. So we want to make sure our sampling frame is correct. In that case, it would most likely be the likely voters, the people who are actually going to vote in the election. And lastly, undercoverage is when we have some portion of the population that's either not sampled or they have a smaller representation in the sample than they do in the entire population.